is Angelik Vizcarrondo-Laboy, and I'm the curator of Belonging, the 2022 NCECA Annual exhibition, which will be on display at the Crocker Museum of Art, an exploration of our connection, and I mean humans' connection to land, whether it be physically, conceptually, or emotionally. I was really thinking about what are the factors, what are the elements that make us connect with a place, and what are the things that make us not do that? And then from that point, it felt pretty natural to then go on to also really consider identity in this, because identity can be greatly influenced and shaped by your surroundings. I often work with artists who use their practice to navigate identity, to have conversations about it, to just share their stories and experiences. And I think those are all interconnected with ideas of belonging. Identity is not only how we see ourselves, but how the world influences us, whether that be circumstances, lived experiences, location, politics, people around you. They all have an effect on who you end up being. The show also feels somewhat personal. As an immigrant from Puerto Rico, the culture is very different. Even though I'm a U.S. citizen, at times I found it hard to feel that I belong in the continental U.S. So I absolutely empathize with a lot of the artists that investigate these topics in their artwork. And I think it's really great to be able to have a platform to sort of bring a lot of these stories together and hopefully also create a lot of empathy with the visitors who come by. Around the time that I received the invitation to do this show, I visited Desert X, which are a bunch of art installations in the middle of the California desert. There was a piece by Nicholas Galanin that was really powerful, I thought. It's this very big sign that looks like the Hollywood sign, but it says Indian land instead. And artist Barrett Johnson spoke very eloquently about what the meaning of the work is, which is that it's not a claim to ownership of land. It is a claim of belonging to land. The words really resonated with me. I absolutely feel different when I'm physically in Puerto Rico. So I understand that feeling of being connected to land. It also made me think of creation stories in which humans supposedly are made out of clay. And clay is inherently earth, which is land. And so this idea that if we are made out of earth, then we do indeed belong to the land. We belong to the dirt that we were made of. Once I knew that belonging was sort of this umbrella word where everything was gonna fall under, I realized how sort of rich the word is and the incredible depth that it has as a concept, a feeling, an action. And so I really got thinking about the word and also how it's a kind of a compound word. You have the first part, be, as in the verb to be, which makes me think of sort of an aspirational journey or an expansive potential, but also an affirmation of existence, as in you are, you exist. And then the other half, longing, which has to do with yearning and desire for something. And so putting those two sort of meanings together, it really makes me think that this exhibition is bringing together a bunch of sort of little stories of these long journeys, these longing journeys towards acceptance of who we are and of each other. This project is about connection. It's about identity. It's not about possession. In fact, they are artworks that will criticize the sort of negative side of belonging, because of course there is a version of belonging that is all about possession. I actually think that most of the problems around the world, and especially in the United States, are caused because of one group of people telling another group of people that they don't belong. And therefore, I think it's a very relevant subject to be discussing. I mean, we're discussing things like what bathroom someone can use, or what you can or can't do with your body, or ideas that you can't even be safe in your own home. Things like that are in the news all the time. And so it just feels very important to have conversations about ideas of belonging. A sense of belonging implies an affinity or a connectedness with a place, social, or cultural group. Belonging is survival. It is a powerful feeling that shapes our identity. While achieving a sense of belonging is fulfilling when realized, it can be a laborious and even painful endeavor otherwise. Belonging strongly signifies spatial relationships, from navigating new territories to remaining rooted to formative places long vacated. Efforts to balance attachments to past and present spaces may evoke nostalgia and dissonance. Many also seek a connection to their ancestors and their land despite distance. Voluntary and involuntary migration has profoundly impacted millions' sense of belonging through disrupted lineages, loss of material culture and narratives, and disconnection from land. Belonging explores the intangible and tangible approaches we engage in developing and maintaining our sense of connectedness across time and space. Belonging also relates to ownership or possession, an interpretation that has caused much harm to humans, non-human species, and natural resources. This exhibition seeks to upend normalized power dynamics by prioritizing humans' desire to belong to something instead of things belonging to them. Acceptance, or lack thereof, also intertwined with that sense of belonging. Identity forms at the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and class, among other categories. While these markers can be keys to unlocking a sense of belonging, we may experience rejection and exclusion without the embrace of others. An affinity to any entity also necessitates bearing the weight of associated histories and realities. For example, belonging to the United States constitutes acknowledging that we live on stolen indigenous land. Its brutal history of slavery continues misogyny, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, and systemic racism that disproportionately affect BIPOC communities. At the root of these issues lies the negation of belonging towards particular groups of people, namely people of color, LGBTQIA, and women, as dictated by colonialist and patriarchal white supremacist ideals. The exhibition Belonging will also showcase the coded ways in which we navigate inhospitable environments, push back against oppressive systems that deny belonging, and the role of community in fostering inclusion. With this in mind, I wanted to pick 5 artists who would address different perspectives on belonging. Salvador Jimenez Flores is a Chicago-based Mexican-American artist who explores W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness. His practice helps him navigate his life in the US while remaining connected to Mexico. However, sometimes there's a feeling he does not belong to either. Maybe he's too Mexican for the US, too American for Mexico. And I think a lot of immigrants can relate to that. I know I can. In response to the political climate created by the previous political administration, Jimenez Flores began a series of sculptures in which he used cacti as a metaphor for the resilience of the Latinx community, which thrives in the United States despite overt actions to invalidate their sense of belonging by government and by civilians alike. And so with those pieces, he was basically sending the message of, we're not going anywhere and we can withstand whatever you throw at us. And in fact, some of the works had some very specific protest language, sort of such as our text that said, "Our existence is resistance." So those pieces are very powerful, and they're protest work, even though they have some humor in them. They're a little bit defiant. Despite the change in administration, Jimenez Flores is still continuing with his series. Issues at the border have not improved. We've all heard about children being separated from families and caged and being tear gassed, and the building of the wall. But even without those sort of very violent, overt things in the media, the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico and the border is still not great. Jimenez Flores uses his likeness in a lot of his work, and part of the reason is because he wants to make sure that people that look like him, and as in generally brown people look like him, are present in the canon of art, in art history, in the field of ceramics, that you can visibly see these people that are being recognized as worthy. Representation and inclusion are crucial motivators in his practice. Then we have the work of Natalia Arbeláez, a New York-based Colombian-American artist whose practice revolves around making connections to the traditions of her indigenous ancestors, the Muisca people of Colombia. So she's looking at indigenous pottery as inspiration for her work. But her practice also involves making figurines that are covered in mayolica, which is this very white glaze that the Spanish people would use in their pottery and brought with them when they colonized Latin America. And so she juxtaposes those with figurines that are just sort of bare terracotta. And the mayolica figures represent the colonial settlers, while the terracotta figures represent the indigenous people of Colombia. The reason why she's doing this is she's trying to bring attention to deep effects of colonization, which have caused the Latin America community to prioritize whiteness, not just in people, but also in things like ceramics. They prefer a mayolica plate versus a terracotta plate. So she's making an effort in her practice to go ahead and bring attention to those histories that are less known, such as the indigenous histories of the Muisca people. Arbeláez also makes work that honors her deceased family members in Colombia by creating sort of rituals inspired by the Muisca people and their burials. And the reason why she does this is because she is unable to attend the funerals because they are so far away. Living in New York, Colombia, it's very far away. But also, it's an attempt to recover histories that have been lost because colonization disrupted lineages. And even though she knows that she has indigenous roots, there's no way she can know who exactly she was connected to. And so part of her practice involves research, but her other part is completely imaginary. She's sort of creating this like very fantastical situations and rituals in order to be able to reconnect with her original land and her ancestors. Much of Alex Anderson's work is an exploration of navigating white-dominated spaces in academia and the art world. Sometimes the pieces are very psychological, expressing some fears of being used or fetishized, or about the taxing nature of having to code switch depending on what space he's in. His work is subversive and humorous and oftentimes cute. He uses a lot of emoji imagery, but upon closer inspection, you'll often see that there's a little bit something that's sinister behind the work. He uses blackface in his practice not as a reclamation of history, but as an engagement with an imposed birthright of what the majority of people perceive his identity to be. He also sees it as a representation of just how he feels when he enters a white space. Habiba El-Sayed is a Muslim artist residing in Canada. Her work often explores her identity as a Muslim woman in a post-9/11 world. Her practice often involves performances and the use of raw clay as a tool of transformation and reclamation. During the quarantine of the pandemic, she started a new series called The Fragile Plane. And in this series, she's really interested in ideas of community and how difficult the pandemic made that, and thinking about how our connections became really dependent on screens. She's thinking about the way that these very thin barriers can connect, but also disconnect. And that also made me think, even if she's just thinking about screens, it makes me think of language barriers, borders, and other kinds of barriers that might arise that might help or not help someone connect with somebody else. Community is very important to her, and so she's really thinking about grief and how that is processed in a time where you're not able to be physically with another person, and also just thinking about communication and the difficulties of communication when it has to happen through a screen. Finally, we have the work of Shinipahanska Luger, who is a Lakota artist from New Mexico. I was scrolling through his website and I realized he had a piece called Belonging, and that just felt like a sign that he should be a part of the show. And that piece in specific, he made this life-size skeleton of a buffalo. There's a video piece that goes along with it. And in that piece, he's thinking about the effects of colonialism, how it affected the indigenous populations, but also the non-human indigenous species, such as the buffalo.
The land is, the ocean is, the sky is, the earth is, and long before we are. But we are the living things. And in this rhythm is our place, not separate, but belonging to something much greater than any single beat. Our edge is defined by its relationship to that which it touches and can be touched, and so it is. There is a story of belonging that began as a blood clot, drying in the grass, on the land. As it coagulated in the sun, it wept and sang out loud, certain of its demise. The sad song was heard by the buffalo, and she did not pass it by, but stops to see what was the matter. Blood clot expressed through the sobs that it was weak, and it would die here, and never be anything but blood spilt on the land. The buffalo replied with a deep breath through her nose that the blood was so pathetic. She first expressed that the blood should be happy, that it is anything at all. And then she proceeded to tell this blood that she was moved by its song, and told the blood that her nation was strong. She then lowered her head and whispered into the blood clot that it could help itself to her blood to increase its numbers, that it could help itself to her muscles to increase its strength, that it could help itself to her hide to protect it from the sun and the sky and the weather, and that her bones were strong and they could be used as tools for the blood, and they could learn to take care of themselves and everything else on the land. And then she gave her life up there, and the blood had a chance and a debt, and soon the blood became a people, and the people remembered the debt, and gave thanks and made many offerings, and took care of the land, and in turn the land took care of them. Later, a different people came, and forced the people to look at the land the way they did. To them it was separate and wild, and must be dominated and controlled. The people disagreed with one another, and and they fought, and more blood was spilt in the grass on the land. In order to defeat the people who belonged to the land, a war of attrition was declared, and the Buffalo Nation, tens of millions strong, were systematically destroyed, and the land was void of a powerful nation, and it began to suffer its absence. And one people was forced to be like the other, and to see the land as something separate, that could be owned and controlled. Their songs and dances and way of life were forbidden, forced to put aside its debts and its belongings. But as an extension of the land, their stories could not be forgotten, for their stories of belonging began as a blood clot drying in the grass.
Generally, he's thinking about how the indigenous peoples in the U.S. have faced so much adversity, genocide. They've been forced to abandon their ancestral homelands. They live in reservations that often don't have running water, or their water supplies threatened, like at Standing Rock. Lugar's work is celebrating the survival of the indigenous people, because a lot of people think and speak about indigenous peoples in the past, but they are very present. And so he's trying to bring attention to current issues as well as past issues, but also celebrate the survival of the indigenous communities of North America. A different piece called Everyone was a collaborative project in which people from the United States and Canada sent him beads, which he then dyed into a photograph of a woman. It's based on data collected about all the missing and murdered women, girls, queer folks, trans folks in the indigenous community, and they're outstanding numbers. And that's just what's actually reported. Who knows how many more that weren't reported. As horrible as some of these subjects are, Lugar is finding a very empathetic way to address them. For example, in Everyone, with everybody from the United States and Canada coming together to make these beads for this project, and a more recent project called Something to Hold On, he was asking people to make beads or make a little imprint on a piece of clay. And I think that has a very democratic way of involving anyone and everyone with clay. And it creates a space of collaboration. It creates a space of belonging at the end of the day, because everybody's coming together to hopefully empathize with whatever the subject is, to have conversations about it, but in a very sort of equal way, because clay is just such an accessible medium. And Lugar is very good at helping other people realize that. With that, I'll just say I'm very excited about this show. We're in the early stages of figuring out how it's going to shape out, but looking forward to what that sort of final story is. I think it will be a great gathering of stories, of experiences, and hopefully our visitors are able to empathize and they're able to see themselves in the stories that are shared. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to making my selections in the open call. I'm hoping to find other perspectives that complement the perspectives that I just shared, to tell a very sort of diverse and robust story of belonging. And ultimately, I just look forward to being together in one place and celebrate our amazing ceramics community. I really hope you can come see the show. Thank you so much.